Hey guys, tonight we're easing into something long, slow, and gently exhausting. So settle back, let your eyes get heavy, and just let the words drift by. We're not racing anywhere. We're just going to wander through old stone corridors, quiet palaces, and the sort of lives that looked powerful from a distance but felt deeply uncomfortable if you were actually inside them. This is history meant to hum softly in the background, not jump out at you. So let's begin where fear, ambition, and legacy all quietly tangled together. We start with a woman who refused to fade politely into the background, Olympias, the mother of Alexander. She had already survived snakes, betrayals, and kings who underestimated her, and at this point she was not in the mood to be ignored. Her son was gone, but his shadow lingered everywhere, and she intended to stand right inside it, arms crossed, daring the world to look away. She aligned herself with Roxana and the boy Alexander the Fourth, not out of grandmotherly warmth, but because bloodlines mattered more than comfort. The generals who once bowed to Alexander had grown ambitious, and of course they had armies now, grudges, and a taste for power that didn't include kneeling to an aging queen. Olympias noticed. She always noticed. She waited. She watched. And when Antipater died and Cassander took his place, she understood exactly what kind of man he was: cold, precise, and very interested in burying old legends. A collision was inevitable. Alexander was gone, but Olympias was still very much alive, and she did not retire quietly. When she returned to Macedon, it wasn't with tears or nostalgia. She came back like a storm wearing royal jewelry. With the backing of Polyperchon, she ended with an army, and the response was immediate. Gates opened, soldiers defected. Some enemies hesitated, remembering what her name still meant. She wasted no time. Cassandra's loyalists were hunted down, and Philip III, the fragile puppet king, was executed. His wife was offered the chance to end her own life. When she refused, Olympias had her killed anyway, because mercy was never her brand. It was all carefully staged, heavy with symbolism, because Olympias understood theater. She wanted everyone to remember that Alexander's bloodline ruled by right. For a brief moment, it worked. She held Macedon again, older but no less terrifying. But power in that world was always temporary, and Cassander was patient. He returned stronger. Her allies fell away. She retreated to Pydna, surrounded, besieged, watching the walls close in. For nearly a year, she endured hunger and disease without bending. When she finally surrendered, she was handed not to soldiers, but to the families of those she had condemned. They sentenced her to death. And when the moment came, no one dared strike her. She stood there, still wrapped in myth. Finally, outsiders were brought in, people with no memory of her power, and Olympias was killed quietly, the mother of a god reduced to dust. Her story didn't end with triumph, but it didn't end small either. She lingered in memory, coiled and hissing, refusing to be forgotten. And as her story fades into stone and legend, we drift further back across the sea to a place that feels less like a ruin and more like a dream: Knossos. On Crete, a palace that twists and doubles back on itself, where rooms lead nowhere and staircases forget their purpose. It was built long before classical Greece ever sharpened its edges, and it wasn't a fortress. It was a city under one roof. Light wells, storage rooms, shrines, workshops, plumbing that worked better than anyone expected, bulls everywhere. Bulls painted, carved, honored. Arthur Evans, would later dig it up and decide this had to be the labyrinth. Because honestly, what else could it be? No literal maze was found, no monster, but the palace itself was confusing enough to make the myth feel reasonable. The Minoans didn't leave us readable words. They left symbols, snakes, double axes, frescoes of people dancing and leaping over charging bulls like that was a perfectly normal thing to do. Their world was fluid, colorful, and strangely calm for a civilization that dominated the sea. They didn't conquer so much as trade. They didn't glorify war. They glorified movement and balance, and then, quietly, they vanished. Earthquakes, volcanoes, foreign influence, internal collapse. No dramatic final scream, just empty rooms and fading paint. By the time later Greeks told stories about minotaurs and tributes, Knossos was already ancient. The palace became myth because myth was the only language left. And from palaces, we drift toward walls. Because eventually, someone always wants in. Battering rams came first. Simple at the beginning, just a tree trunk and a group of determined men. But engineers improved them, hung them inside frames, covered them with roofs, and turned them into instruments of dread. The Assyrians understood spectacle. They rolled their rams forward while archers fired overhead, making sure defenders understood exactly what was coming. The Greeks refined the idea. The Romans industrialized it. They built massive rams suspended by chains, swung in rhythm, thunder against stone. Teamwork mattered. A stalled ram was useless, but a moving one meant surrender was suddenly very appealing. Then came catapults, which decided that walls shouldn't be safe even at a distance. Torsion power, twisted sinew, stored energy released in violent arcs, stones, bolts, fire. The ballista behaved like a giant crossbow. The stone throwers lobbed destruction from afar. Romans made them portable because, of course, they did. These machines weren't just about damage, they were messages. Corpses were flung, diseased bodies sent sailing over walls as early biological warfare. The sky itself became hostile. And then there was the trebuchet, slow, majestic, unavoidable. Gravity turned into a weapon. Counterweights dropped. Arms swung. Stones flew in long, elegant arcs. A well-built trebuchet could reduce confidence long before it reduced walls. There's a reason cities surrendered just seeing one assembled. It took time to build. It took patience to use. But when worked, it worked thoroughly. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. It was inevitability given form. Siege towers brought things closer. Big wooden structures rolling toward walls, covered in hides, packed with soldiers. They didn't whisper. They announced themselves. Height became a battlefield. The Assyrians experimented. The Hellenistic kingdoms went theatrical. Demetrius built a tower so ambitious it collapsed under its own weight, which feels appropriate. The idea was simple. Get above the wall, drop a bridge, turn defense into chaos. They were vulnerable to fire, mud, ditches, and clever terrain. But when they reached the wall, the fight became immediate and brutal. Below ground, the work was quieter, tunneling, sapping, digging beneath walls, propping them up with wood, then burning the supports. The wall would collapse without warning. Defenders listened for picks. Countermining turned soil into battlefields, knives, torches, panic. There was no glory in it, only darkness and fear. But it worked. At Rochester Castle, pig fat burned beneath the walls, and stone came down. Engineers became experts in soil and collapse. If you couldn't go over the wall and you couldn't go through it, you went under. Defenders weren't passive. Greek fire clung and burned even on water, boiling oil and sand poured through murder holes. Gravity did the rest. Stones, logs, dead animals, traps everywhere. Delay was the goal. Every minute mattered. Sieges were patience. Contests and disease often decided more than weapons. And always there was fear. The theater of it all. Engines displayed openly. No surprises, just dread growing slowly. Payloads carried messages. Heads, bodies, silence before impact. The creak of ropes, the pause before release. Commanders wanted the mind to break before the wall, and often it did. Eventually, gunpowder arrived, and the old machines slowly disappeared. But their ideas never did. Trajectory, force, psychology. The ancient question remained the same. How do you overcome something designed to endure? The answer still rests quietly in stone ruins across the world. Walls continued to rise, and engines continued to evolve because the ancient world never stopped building barriers meant to separate people. Castles, cities, and fortresses were layered with stone and conviction, each silently challenging anyone who approached. Siege warfare was never quick, it was deliberately slow. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, until time itself became a tool. Both sides waited, watching the same horizon, hearing the same sounds, learning patience whether they wished to or not. Inside the walls, daily life grew smaller. Supplies were measured carefully, storage rooms became guarded spaces, every resource gained importance. Families stayed close. The city's world slowly narrowed to walls, towers, and quiet routines. The structures remained standing, but they felt less certain with each passing day. Outside, the surrounding army formed a settlement of its own. Tents aligned like streets. Fires burned steadily. Engineers worked constantly, measuring distances and refining calculations. There was a rhythm to it all. Build, pause, test, wait, repeat. It was not dramatic combat, but endurance, an extended challenge of discipline and resolve. Conditions were difficult on both sides. Camps and cities faced similar challenges. Leaders understood this and often relied on time rather than force. Waiting became strategy. Psychology mattered as much as construction. Visible signals reminded defenders they were being observed. Sounds carried intentionally. Silence, too, played its part, allowing uncertainty to fill the gaps. Each quiet night raised questions about what might come next. Communication continued even during tension. Messages crossed walls. Terms were discussed carefully, revised thoughtfully, sometimes rejected. Formal language remained even when circumstances were strained. When openings finally appeared, they rarely ended matters immediately. Defenders responded quickly, reinforcing weak points with whatever materials were available. Attackers tested reactions, advancing and withdrawing, measuring resistance. Long periods of waiting often ended with short, decisive moments. Not every siege ended with destruction. Many concluded with agreements. Promises were made. Cities were preserved in exchange for loyalty. Practicality often outweighed spectacle because maintaining value mattered. Over time, defenses evolved. Walls grew thicker. Shapes changed. Towers became rounded. Layers increased. Every improvement inspired a counter, and every solution invited a new challenge. Builders and breakers learned from one another, creating an ongoing cycle of adaptation. Engineers became essential figures. They were planners, thinkers, and problem solvers. They understood balance, pressure, and structure. Their calculations guided outcomes more quietly than weapons ever could. Rulers depended on them. Success could end conflicts without open confrontation. Failure could force retreat. In this way, knowledge became power. Beneath everything was belief. Defenders trusted their structures. Attackers trusted that no structure was beyond challenge. With enough time, both views proved true. The ancient world understood a simple truth that still applies today. Nothing created by people is permanent, especially when another person decides it should change. The emotional toll was heavy. Commanders aged visibly during long sieges. They slept poorly. They paced constantly. They watched the same horizon day after day, feeling time stretch thin. The pressure to decide when to attack, when to wait, when to negotiate weighed heavily. A wrong decision could cost thousands of lives or years of reputation. For soldiers, siege warfare was monotony punctuated by terror. Long hours of nothing, followed by moments of chaos. Climbing ladders under fire, swinging rams while arrows fell, holding shields as stones crashed nearby. They weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting because stopping meant punishment or death. Civilians suffered the most quietly and thoroughly. They weren't trained. They weren't armed. They simply endured. Hunger reshaped daily life. Fear settled into routine. Children grew up learning the sounds of engines and impact like lullabies. By the time a siege ended, survival itself felt like victory. And when cities fell, the aftermath lingered. Broken walls remained visible for generations, scars in stone reminding everyone who had passed through. Fire damage blackened buildings long after banners were gone. Some cities recovered, others never did. They became cautionary tales, whispered warnings about resistance taken too far. Yet, even knowing all this, people kept building walls. They kept trusting stone. They kept believing height and thickness could buy safety, because the alternative, living without defense, felt worse. The ancient world accepted siege warfare as inevitable, like storms or famine. It wasn't questioned, it was endured. As centuries passed, techniques refined, but the rhythm stayed the same. Wait, build, break, repeat. The weapons changed slowly, but the mindset didn't. Siege warfare was about control, patience, and inevitability. It wasn't about speed. It was about wearing reality down until it cracked. And so history moved forward, not in clean victories, but in cycles of construction and destruction. Walls rose, walls fell. Engineers adjusted, soldiers marched, cities learned and forgot and learned again. There was no final lesson, no perfect defense, only adaptation. The stone remembers this. Even now, ancient walls lean and crumble quietly, shaped by hands that believed they would last forever. They didn't, but for a time they stood, and for a time people trusted them. And in that long stretch of waiting, between the first stone laid and the final stone broken, siege warfare ruled the fate of cities, kings, and countless unnamed lives, moving slowly, patiently, exactly as it always had. The slow grind continued because that was the nature of this world. Nothing ended cleanly. Even after walls fell, the idea of them lingered in minds and habits. People rebuilt where stone had failed, stacking new blocks on old scars, convinced this time would be different. They always were. Cities that survived sieges carried the memory quietly. Stories were told not with excitement but with tired voices, recounting how hunger crept in first, how hope faded second, and how fear stayed longest. Children who lived through it grew into adults who trusted no horizon and no silence. They reinforced gates obsessively. They inspected walls daily. They understood that peace was only the space between attempts. Rulers learned lessons too, though often the wrong ones. Some concluded they needed higher walls, thicker walls, more towers, more gates, more complexity. They poured resources into fortification, sometimes neglecting the people inside, as if stone alone could guarantee loyalty. Other rulers focused on stockpiles, granaries were expanded, cisterns deepened, food became strategy. Defense wasn't just about keeping enemies out anymore, it was about outlasting them. The balance between offense and defense shifted back and forth. When walls improved, attackers adapted. When engines grew stronger, defenders reshaped cities. It was a conversation conducted in stone and wood, measured in years rather than words. There was no final answer, only temporary advantage. Some places became famous for never falling. They wore that reputation proudly, like armor, spoken of with respect and quiet dread. Attackers hesitated before approaching them, knowing a siege there would be long, expensive, and humiliating. But even the most legendary strongholds eventually fell, if not to force, then to time, betrayal, or simple neglect. Betrayal was always the wild card. Bribes worked better than battering rams. Gates opened at night. Watchmen looked away. Keys changed hands quietly. A city could spend decades preparing for external threats and still fall because someone inside decided survival mattered more than loyalty. Sieges revealed human nature just as clearly as they tested stone. Weather played its part too. Rain turned camps into mud, stalled engines, rotted supplies. Winter froze trenches and stiffened fingers, making simple tasks painful. Summer brought disease and thirst. Siege warfare ignored seasons, but seasons never ignored sieges. They punished everyone equally. Religion wove itself through the waiting. Defenders prayed to local gods, protectors of walls and hearths. Attackers made offerings for collapse and surrender. Omens were watched obsessively. Birds, fires, dreams. Any sign that the waiting might soon end. Belief offered comfort when action could not. Inside besieged cities, routine became survival. People clung to habits. Morning tasks were done even when supplies were low. Courts still met, markets still opened, though goods dwindled. It was a way of pretending life remained normal, even as reality pressed harder each day. Artists and scribes sometimes continued their work, recording events quietly, knowing their words might be the only part of the city to survive. Stone could fall, wood could burn, but words, once written, had a strange resilience. They carried fear, boredom, and hope across generations. When surrender finally came, it was rarely dramatic. More often, it was a tired decision made by exhausted leaders. They weighed the lives left inside against the honor of resistance and chose survival, even if it meant humiliation. Keys were handed over ceremoniously, flags were lowered slowly, the gates opened not with a crash, but with a sigh. Occupations followed. Some were gentle, others brutal. It depended on the attacker's mood, reputation, and resources. Cities that surrendered early often fared better, though not always. Promises were flexible things. Victors justified broken terms easily. The defeated had no leverage left. Rebuilding began almost immediately, clearing rubble, repairing homes, restoring walls. The cycle restarted before grief had time to settle. People understood instinctively that weakness invited attention and attention invited siege. They worked because stopping meant vulnerability. Over centuries, the art of fortification became increasingly mathematical. Angles calculated carefully, dead zones eliminated, overlapping fields of fire created, towers placed with purpose instead of tradition. Walls weren't just barriers anymore. They were systems. At the same time, Siege engines became more refined, counterweights adjusted, materials improved, crew coordination perfected, engineers documented successes and failures, passing knowledge quietly from one generation to the next. This was not flashy innovation, it was patient accumulation. Sieges also shaped politics. Alliances formed around strongholds. Control of fortified cities meant control of regions. Maps were drawn based on walls and roads, not just borders. Campaigns revolved around sieges rather than battles. Open field engagements became risks. Rulers avoided if a war could decide things more reliably. This made war slower, heavier, more expensive. It drained treasuries and populations alike, but it also reduced chaos in a way. By focusing violence around walls, the ancient world contained destruction even as it intensified it. War became predictable in its own grim rhythm. Not everyone accepted this quietly. Some cities chose desperate measures. Sorties launched at night, attempts to burn engines. Sudden attacks meant to disrupt routine. These moments broke monotony but rarely changed outcomes. They were expressions of defiance more than strategy. Animals were used too. Horses dragged engines, oxen hauled stones, dogs guarded camps. Even they became part of the siege ecosystem, suffering alongside humans, unacknowledged but essential. Time itself warped during sieges. Days blurred together, markers became meaningless. People measured progress by cracks in walls or empty granaries rather than calendars. The waiting altered perception, stretching moments thin and compressing months into memory fragments. When historians later wrote about these events, they focused on outcomes: fall of a city, victory of a king. They rarely captured the boredom, the smell, the endless repetition. But those who lived it remembered that more than anything. The waiting defined them. And yet, despite all this knowledge, siege warfare never disappeared. It persisted because it worked. It bent reality slowly but reliably. It rewarded patience and punished recklessness. It aligned perfectly with human stubbornness and fear. As generations passed, stories of great sieges became warnings and inspirations. Commanders studied them, defenders learned from them, children grew up hearing them whispered at night. They became part of cultural memory, shaping how people understood power and safety. Stone walls continued to rise across landscapes, tracing the ambitions of those who built them. Some were crude, others elegant. All were statements. They said, "This place matters. This place is worth defending. This place believes it will last." Attackers read those statements clearly. They responded with engines, trenches, and time. They answered belief with pressure. They knew that eventually something would give. And so the ancient world moved forward, not smoothly, but through these long pauses of tension and endurance. Wars were not decided in single days, but in seasons of waiting. Sieges shaped borders, populations, and rulers quietly, without spectacle. The land itself bears their imprint. Raised earth where camps once stood, ditches softened by rain, stones displaced and never returned. Nothing announces these scars loudly. They blend into the ground, patient reminders of how often humans tested each other's limits. Through it all, one truth remained constant. No wall was invincible. No engine was perfect. No city was immune. The balance shifted endlessly, but certainty never existed. Only preparation, endurance, and hope that time would favor one side more than the other. And so the story continues forward, not looping back, but carrying its weight into each new generation, each new wall, each new attempt to hold space against inevitability, moving steadily onward through the ancient world exactly as it always did, The knowledge carried forward not as a clean inheritance, but as habit and instinct. Builders did what their fathers had done and adjusted only where failure had taught them otherwise. Stones were cut thicker, gates were narrowed, angles sharpened. Every change was a memory made solid. A wall was never just architecture, it was accumulated anxiety. Some cities became layered like history books. The oldest walls sat buried beneath newer ones, foundations swallowed by later ambition. Archaeologists would one day marvel at this, but at the time it was simply practical. No one tore down what still held weight. They built on top of it, trusting gravity and tradition. Life inside fortified cities shaped personalities. People grew cautious, inward looking, suspicious of strangers, quick to notice patterns. They learned to read the mood of guards, the tone of horns, the rhythm of footsteps on stone. The city itself became a living thing, communicating through sounds and routines. Rulers rarely lived like ordinary people during sieges. They occupied inner citadels surrounded by layers of protection. Their meals remained better longer, their water cleaner. They spoke of sacrifice while being insulated from its worst effects. This disconnect often bred resentment, though fear kept it quiet. Still, rulers were prisoners too. They could not leave without risking collapse. Their authority depended on staying visible yet protected. It was a strange balance, projecting strength while trapped by it. They paced halls, listened to reports, waited for outcomes they could not control. Messengers became vital and doomed figures. They slipped through lines at night, risking capture, carrying promises and pleas. Some never returned. Others arrived exhausted, bearing news too late to matter. Their journeys stitched together the isolated worlds created by siege. Disease thrived in these conditions: crowded spaces, stagnant air, weakened bodies. Defenders feared it as much as weapons. Attackers suffered too. Camps spread illness quickly. Sometimes disease decided sieges faster than engines ever could. Food transformed from sustenance into currency. Rations were measured obsessively, weights debated, portions argued over, hoarding punished harshly, sharing praised publicly but rarely practiced fully. Morality bent under hunger. Animals inside cities became both assets and liabilities. They were food, transport, warmth, and risk. Once fodder ran low, difficult choices followed. Horses were slaughtered. Dogs disappeared. Chickens vanished quietly. These decisions were made without ceremony. Grief swallowed by necessity. Children experienced sieges differently. They adapted quickly, normalizing deprivation. They played among rubble. They mimicked guards and engines in games. What scarred adults became background noise to them. This resilience came at a cost. They grew up fast, patience carved into them early. Education continued in fragments. Teachers taught when possible. Lessons shortened. Focus shifted from philosophy to practicality. How to calculate supplies. How to identify weak masonry. How to stay quiet. This was learning shaped by pressure. Religion intensified, but also fractured. Some saw sieges as punishment, others as tests. Prophets emerged, promising deliverance or doom. Most were ignored. Some gained followings. Desperation made people listen to voices they would normally dismiss. Music survived strangely well. Simple songs echoed through streets at night, sung softly to conserve energy. They comforted more than speeches ever could. Sound carried differently in enclosed spaces, wrapping around stone, lingering longer than expected. When attackers camped for long periods, they built temporary towns of their own. Tents gave way to huts. Markets appeared. Blacksmiths worked constantly. This semi permanent life blurred the line between war and settlement. They waited as much as defenders did. Soldiers adapted psychologically. They learned patience. They learned how to be still. They learned how to watch without acting. This restraint was harder than combat. Many broke under it. Engine crews treated their machines almost religiously. They cleaned them, repaired them, spoke of them with pride and frustration. A broken engine felt personal. A successful strike felt vindicating, even if unseen. Defenders listened constantly. The sound of digging, the creak of wood, the murmur of camps. Sound was intelligence. Silence, too. The absence of expected noise could signal danger more than noise itself. Night altered everything. Darkness emboldened raids but magnified fear. Torches revealed as much as they hid. Mistakes multiplied. People stumbled. Orders were misheard. Confusion ruled. Fire was both tool and terror. Uncontrolled fire meant disaster. Defenders feared it spreading inside walls. Attackers feared losing engines to sparks. Every flame was watched carefully. Negotiations occurred intermittently. Flags raised briefly. Envoys exchanged. Phrases repeated ritualistically. Honor mentioned. Obligations cited. These talks rarely changed outcomes but offered illusion of control. When walls finally failed, the transition from waiting to chaos was abrupt. Defenders rushed to breaches, attackers surged forward, months of tension released in moments. The contrast was overwhelming. Yet even then, not every siege ended in slaughter. Some ended quietly, resistance collapsing inward rather than outward. Cities surrendered at the last moment, lives spared by exhaustion rather than mercy. Afterward, landscapes changed. Camps dismantled. Engine pits filled in. Trenches softened. The physical signs faded faster than the memories. People spoke less of the waiting and more of the ending because endings were easier to frame. New rulers imposed order quickly. Laws adjusted. Taxes levied. Guards replaced. The city adapted again because adaptation was survival. Identity bent rather than broke. Stories of famous sieges traveled far. They were exaggerated, simplified. They became lessons stripped of nuance, but the core remained. Endurance mattered. Time was a weapon. As centuries rolled forward, the pattern repeated endlessly. Cities rose, walls thickened, attackers learned, defenders adjusted. No side ever truly won the conversation. Some places became symbols rather than strategic assets. They were attacked because of what they represented, not what they offered. These sieges were the longest driven by pride as much as necessity. Engineers gained prestige. They advised kings, shaped campaigns. They were valued for patience and calculation rather than bravery. This shift subtly changed how war was perceived. Maps grew more detailed, noting elevations, soils, water sources. Every line mattered. Planning extended months ahead. Surprises decreased, replaced by methodical pressure. The emotional toll accumulated quietly. Veterans carried siege memories longer than battle memories. Battles were loud and brief. Sieges were quiet and long. They seeped into dreams. Defenders who survived one siege often struggled in peace. Silence unsettled them. Open gates felt wrong. They expected threat constantly. Attackers too carried habits. They distrusted open spaces. They preferred structure. They measured time differently. Architecture reflected this psychology. Homes clustered tightly, windows narrowed, streets curved unpredictably. Defensive thinking infiltrated daily life. Even festivals adapted. They were shorter, more subdued. Celebrations acknowledged survival, rather than joy. Gratitude replaced exuberance. Leadership was judged harshly after sieges. Success excused cruelty. Failure erased goodwill quickly. Memory was unforgiving. Some rulers ordered walls expanded immediately, terrified of repeat vulnerability. Others dismantled parts deliberately, believing submission reduced risk. Both choices carried consequences. Trade routes shifted based on fortified cities. Safe passage mattered. Merchants avoided places known for frequent sieges, starving them economically over time. Sieges thus shaped economies as much as borders. They redirected wealth quietly. The land remembered. Earthworks softened but remained. Ditches filled unevenly. Roads bent around old scars. Future builders worked around them unknowingly. Through all this, the logic stayed simple: control space, control time, control fear. Sieges were the purest expression of that logic. They were slow violence, patient domination. They rewarded those who could wait longer, endure more, and break less visibly. As generations passed, people stopped questioning why cities were built this way. It simply was. This was how the world worked. Children learned early that walls meant safety and danger equally. They grew up understanding both sides instinctively. And so history moved forward steadily, not looping, not restarting, but carrying accumulated weight from one stone to the next, one wall to another, one siege to the next, each event adding to a long, unbroken chain of endurance and pressure that defined the ancient. The craft refined itself further as knowledge settled into tradition rather than invention. Engineers no longer experimented wildly. They trusted methods that had already proven patient and cruel enough. Stone quality was tested before walls were raised. Mortar recipes guarded like secrets. Soil was studied quietly because the ground decided more than any plan ever could. Cities that expected trouble planned outward as much as inward. Fields were cleared to deny cover, trees cut back, hills reshaped subtly to control approach. The landscape became part of the defense, shaped slowly over decades, sometimes centuries, without urgency but with intention. Attacking armies learned to read these landscapes like warnings. Bare ground meant confidence, gentle slopes meant calculation, sudden marshes or uneven terrain signaled deliberate inconvenience. Nothing was accidental anymore. Sieges demanded administration as much as force. Accounts were kept, labor rotations planned, engine crews rested in shifts. Commanders learned that exhaustion killed momentum faster than resistance. Inside walls, councils debated constantly. Arguments repeated with small variations. Push for surrender. Hold longer. Try a sortie. Wait for allies. The same voices clashed until hunger or fear tipped balance. These debates mattered deeply to those involved, but often changed little. Outcome: trust eroded slowly. People watched neighbors closely. Hoarding accusations spread. Guards were rotated to prevent bribery. Everyone became a potential liability. Sieges did not just test walls, they tested social fabric. The longer a siege lasted, the quieter it became. Early noise gave way to murmurs. Shouting was replaced by whispers. Movement slowed. Energy was conserved unconsciously. Even thoughts seemed heavier. Attackers experienced a similar quiet. Camps settled into routine. Cooking fires burned low. Songs faded. Soldiers slept more. The waiting dulled aggression, turning war into occupation without ownership. Occasionally, violence flared suddenly. A breach attempt, a night raid, a fire. These moments shocked everyone awake briefly before silence returned, heavier than before. Memory stretched oddly. People recalled the beginning vaguely but remembered recent days clearly. The present dominated consciousness. History shrank to survival. Siege engines aged quickly, wood warped, ropes frayed, metal fatigued. Constant maintenance was required. This labor was invisible in records but decisive in reality. Defenders attempted sabotage whenever possible. Loose stones dropped silently, cables cut if reached, poisons rumored even if rarely used. Fear amplified effectiveness beyond reality. Food substitutions became common. Grain mixed with bark, flour stretched thin, bread darkened and hardened. Nutrition mattered less than fullness, even briefly. Water was guarded obsessively, wells protected, cisterns sealed, contamination feared above all. Water loss meant immediate collapse. Rituals adapted, prayers shortened, festivals canceled or reshaped. Mourning became collective rather than individual. Grief had no space to be private. Animals behaved strangely under siege. Noises unsettled them. They sensed tension. Barking increased. Horses refused restlessness, mirrored human anxiety. Artisans found new purpose. Blacksmiths repaired tools constantly. Carpenters patched damage. Weavers repurposed cloth for bandages or insulation. Every skill bent toward endurance. Stories changed tone. Legends told during sieges emphasized survival over heroism, clever escapes, small victories, stories where patience mattered more than bravery. When walls cracked, the sound traveled far. It echoed differently than anything else. Defenders recognized it instantly. It silenced streets. More than alarms, it commanded attention. Commanders reacted with rehearsed calm. They had imagined this moment countless times. Plans activated instinctively. Troops moved without order sometimes, habits taking over. Attackers searched carefully, wary of traps. Breaches were dangerous precisely because they seemed promising. They funneled movement, they concentrated death. The ground near walls became layered with debris, broken stone, shattered wood, discarded tools, evidence of months compressed into meters. If attackers were repelled, morale spiked briefly. Defenders celebrated quietly, knowing the pressure would resume. Attackers adjusted methods rather than retreat. Some sieges ended not with breach but negotiation triggered by these moments. Perceived weakness or strength shifted calculations suddenly. When surrender terms were discussed, details mattered immensely. Who kept arms? Who paid tribute? Who remained in power? These decisions shaped decades. Victory parades rarely occurred immediately. Fatigue dampened triumph. Attackers entered cities cautiously, more concerned with order than celebration. Occupations required restraint or ruthlessness. Either approach was calculated. Excessive cruelty bred rebellion. Leniency risked defiance. Balance was difficult and often misjudged. Cities changed hands but remained. Their identity shifted gradually through law, language, and custom rather than force alone. Walls were repaired quickly by new rulers. They understood their value immediately. Defense served everyone eventually. Lessons spread unevenly. Some regions advanced rapidly, others clung to outdated designs. Tradition resisted change even when evidence mounted. Sieges influenced migration. Populations moved towards safer cities, swelling them beyond design capacity. This increased vulnerability, ironically. Urban planning struggled to adapt. Density increased. Fire risk rose. Disease spread faster. Safety bred new dangers. Markets adjusted. Siege supplies became commodities. Wood, rope, iron. Food stockpiles gained value. People profited quietly from preparation. Knowledge transmission relied on apprenticeships. Engineers trained successors carefully. This continuity mattered more than innovation. Language absorbed siege vocabulary, metaphors. Sieges became symbols in speech for pressure and endurance, shaping thought patterns. Poetry from these periods often avoided glory. It focused on waiting, longing, and fatigue. Emotional restraint mirrored lived experience. Time continued forward steadily, indifferent to individual suffering. Cities fell or held. Histories recorded outcomes, but not the waiting. Generations later, descendants walked streets unaware of the exact locations where tunnels collapsed or engines stood. The city moved on. Yet behavior retained echoes. People locked doors reflexively, stored supplies carefully, distrusted sudden silence. These habits persisted. Borders stabilized temporarily around fortified centers, power clustered where walls stood strongest, politics followed masonry. Some rulers attempted to outlaw private fortifications, fearing rebellion. They understood walls empowered resistance. These laws were rarely enforced fully. The cycle adapted but never vanished. Sieges remained the slow heartbeat of conflict, steady and unavoidable. As centuries progressed, materials improved incrementally. Stone shaping refined, mortar hardened, engine tolerances improved. These changes accumulated subtly. Cities became tougher, but also more expensive to maintain. Defense drained resources continuously. Peace required investment equal to war. Philosophers debated morality of sieges quietly. Some questioned prolonged suffering, others justified it as necessary order. These debates rarely altered practice. Commanders measured success not by speed but efficiency, resources spent versus control gained. Time mattered. Every siege added to collective understanding, even when forgotten individually. Knowledge embedded itself invisibly. Thus, the ancient world pressed onward, shaped by walls and waiting, by patience learned through necessity, never looping backward, never escaping the slow logic that governed stone, earth, and human endurance as history continued forward without pause. The understanding of siege warfare settled so deeply into the bones of society that it stopped being discussed openly. It became assumed knowledge, like the changing of seasons or the certainty of death. People did not ask if a city would one day face a siege. They asked when. Craft guilds adjusted their priorities. Stonemasons specialized in defensive cuts. Carpenters learned how to reinforce gates quickly. Blacksmiths focused on fittings and hinges more than ornamentation. Function outweighed beauty without anyone needing to say it aloud. Even rulers who dreamed of expansion understood defense came first. They might speak of glory and conquest, but their treasurers quietly allocated funds to walls, towers, and stores. This was survival masked as ambition. Children growing up inside walls learned to read structures instinctively. They knew which towers were oldest, which sections creaked in wind, which gates guards favored. These details formed mental maps carried into adulthood. When peace stretched long, complacency crept in. Maintenance slipped slightly. Cracks went unrepaired. Ditches filled gradually. These were subtle shifts, unnoticed until danger returned. Sieges punished neglect harshly. Veterans warned against this. They remembered the waiting. They remembered hunger. But memory faded faster than stone eroded. New generations assumed strength would persist without effort. Attackers watched closely. They noticed neglected walls and overgrown approaches. They understood patience, rewarded observation. Sieges began long before camps were built. Rumors preceded armies. Defenders heard whispers of movement months in advance. These rumors caused anxiety but also preparation. False alarms drained energy. Real threats blurred into background noise. When armies finally appeared, reactions varied. Some cities panicked, others responded with practiced calm. The difference often lay in leadership quality, in collective memory. Siege camps reflected hierarchy clearly. Commanders occupied elevated ground. Engineers clustered near machines. Laborers worked relentlessly. The camp mirrored the city. It threatened a temporary reflection. Supply lines defined siege length. Attackers guarded them obsessively. Defenders targeted them when possible. Success or failure often hinged on these invisible arteries. Raiding parties ventured out under cover of darkness. Defenders struck camps. Attackers retaliated. These actions disrupted routine but rarely altered overall trajectory. They were expressions of resistance more than strategy. The land around besieged cities suffered immensely. Fields were stripped, wells poisoned or drained, trees felled. The environment paid the price for human endurance. After sieges ended, recovery took years. Farmers returned cautiously. Soils needed restoration. Populations, thinned by famine and disease, required replacement. Migration filled gaps unevenly. Some cities never fully recovered. They lingered, weakened, eventually eclipsed by others, better positioned or more fortunate. Sieges reshaped regional importance quietly. Records of sieges grew more technical over time, less poetry, more measurements, engine dimensions, supply calculations. These texts guided future campaigns with cold efficiency. Engineers gained authority rivaling generals. They advised rulers directly. Their words carried weight because stone listened to them. Defenders attempted innovations too, new gate mechanisms, interlocking walls, hidden passages. Some worked, some failed, but every attempt reflected desperation mixed with hope. Psychological strain manifested differently. Some withdrew inward, others became reckless. Arguments flared over small issues. Stress magnified everything. Leadership required constant presence. Absence bred rumor. Rulers learned to appear calm even when uncertain. Their composure steadied others. Food distribution became ritualized. Public rationing aimed to prevent unrest. Fairness mattered as much as quantity. Perceived injustice sparked conflict faster than hunger. Prisons filled with suspected traitors. Evidence was thin. Fear drove decisions. These measures sometimes preserved order, sometimes destroyed trust permanently. Faith leaders played crucial roles. They comforted, they disciplined, they interpreted events, they could calm crowds or inflame them unintentionally. The soundscape of siege evolved. Early clamor softened into persistent background noise. Engine creaks, boot steps, murmurs. These sounds became part of daily life. Sleep patterns shifted. People slept lightly, woke frequently, listened constantly. Rest never felt complete. Attackers experienced monotony too. They counted days mechanically. They carved marks. They gambled. They argued. They waited. Victory fatigue set in before victory arrived. Expectation dulled excitement. The prospect of collapse felt heavy rather than triumphant. When breaches finally succeeded, attackers often hesitated briefly. The unknown inside walls intimidated them. They had waited so long that rushing felt dangerous. Defenders at that point fought reflexively. Some resisted fiercely, others surrendered instantly. The difference lay not in courage but exhaustion. Once control was established, new routines replaced old ones quickly. Survival demanded adaptation. Resistance faded as necessity took over. Architectural styles shifted subtly. Post-siege, rebuilding favored practicality. Rounder towers, thicker bases, fewer decorative elements. These choices reflected lessons learned. Trade slowly resumed. Merchants returned cautiously. Memories of danger lingered, influencing routes and schedules. Political narratives reshaped sieges after the fact. Victors claimed inevitability. Defeated cited betrayal of fate. The truth sat quietly between. Sieges became reference points for calendars. Before the siege, after the siege, events oriented around them. Over generations, stories lost detail but kept emotion, waiting, endurance, fear. These themes persisted. Cities that endured multiple sieges developed reputations. They attracted settlers seeking safety and deterred attackers wary of cost. This concentration of population increased political power but also made cities tempting targets. The paradox persisted. Military theory matured around this reality. War became about control rather than annihilation. Sieges fit this perfectly. Some cultures emphasized swift conquest, others favored attrition. These preferences shaped regional histories. No matter the approach, siege warfare remained central. It dictated planning, resource allocation, and leadership styles. Time pressed forward relentlessly. Stone aged, wood rotted, iron rusted. People adapted and rebuilt. Even when borders shifted, wars remained. They outlasted rulers and armies. They stood as silent witnesses. Eventually, some cities chose to dismantle sections deliberately, signaling submission or alliance. This act was symbolic and risky. Others doubled down, expanding defenses dramatically, daring challenges. These choices shaped destiny quietly. Thus, the ancient world continued its slow march, shaped by walls and waiting, by human patience stretched across seasons and generations, never looping backward, always carrying forward the weight of every stone laid, every day endured, every siege survived or lost, as history moved steadily onward without pause or repetition. As the centuries pressed on, the presence of wars became less a reaction and more an assumption. Cities were conceived already expecting pressure. Plans were drawn with siege in mind long before the first stone was set. The idea of being enclosed, protected, and tested was woven into the concept of urban life itself. Builders thought in layers, an outer wall to slow, an inner wall to resist, a final stronghold to endure. These were not signs of pessimism, but realism. Every layer bought time, and time was the most valuable currency any city possessed. Inside these layered defenses, social structures adjusted, people lived closer together, shared courtyards became common, storage spaces multiplied, private space shrank while communal responsibility grew. This closeness bred cooperation, but also tension. Every action mattered more when survival depended on neighbors. Leadership councils evolved to include specialists, engineers, supply masters, health overseers. Decisions became collective not because of ideology but necessity. No single mind could track every variable of a prolonged siege. Even justice adapted. Punishments changed. Focus shifted from morality to stability. Crimes that threatened cohesion were treated harshly. Small thefts of food could provoke severe response because they endangered everyone. Siege memory became institutionalized. Cities recorded inventories meticulously, not just what they had, but how long it lasted previously. This data guided preparation quietly. Attacking forces refined their patience. They understood that haste wasted resources. They measured success by pressure maintained rather than damage inflicted. Sieges became exercises in restraint. Communication evolved subtly. Signal fires, flags, horns, each method carefully regulated to avoid confusion. Miscommunication during a siege could undo months of preparation. Within camps, hierarchy tightened, discipline increased, boredom was dangerous. Commanders enforced routines strictly to prevent decay of order. Weather patterns were studied carefully. Attackers learned when rain softened ground enough to hinder defenders, when heat weakened resolve. These observations accumulated slowly. Defenders mirrored this attentiveness. They watched clouds, wind direction, fire risk increased or decreased based on these factors. Small details carried weight. Markets inside cities transformed into ration distribution centers. Money lost importance. Allocation replaced trade. Fairness mattered more than wealth. Artisans adapted tools for war. Milling equipment adjusted to grind alternative materials. Loams mixed with grain. Survival encouraged innovation within limits. Education narrowed. Children learned arithmetic through ration counting, geometry through wall measurement. Theoretical learning faded. Practical knowledge dominated. Festivals disappeared almost entirely during long sieges. Time markers dissolved. People lost track of years, remembering only stages of endurance. Attacking armies sometimes grew attached to the places they besieged. They spent so long outside walls that familiarity bred strange respect. This did not prevent destruction but softened narratives afterward. Negotiations occurred repeatedly without resolution. Each side tested resolve. Each meeting drained energy but preserved possibility. Prisoners taken during skirmishes became bargaining tools, information sources. They were treated carefully, valued more for knowledge than punishment. Defensive innovations included angled approaches, hidden buttresses, false weaknesses designed to lure attackers. These strategies required deep understanding of enemy thinking. Attackers countered with probing actions, feigned assaults, test shots, small collapses intentionally triggered to study responses. This was warfare as conversation. The soil beneath cities bore immense stress. Tunnels weakened foundations. Settlement occurred unevenly. Structures shifted imperceptibly. This slow movement mattered greatly. Citizens sensed changes. They noticed doors misaligning, cracks forming in familiar walls. These signs produced unease long before visible damage. Sound once again played crucial role. The dull thud of earth collapsing underground sent fear through streets. People stopped breathing to listen. Countermining became an obsession. Special crews trained to detect vibrations. They listened through metal rods pressed to stone, interpreting subtle echoes. Encounters underground were brutal and brief. Light was scarce. Space was limited. There was no room for formation or retreat. These clashes were intimate and terrifying. Yet even these horrors became routine. People adapted to fear because they had no choice. When defenders succeeded in collapsing attacker tunnels first, morale lifted slightly. These small victories sustained endurance more than major successes. Attacker casualties underground were concealed from public view, minimizing morale impact within camps. Food shortages deepened. Malnutrition altered behavior. People became lethargic. Decisions slowed. Emotions dulled. This numbness was dangerous. Leaders attempted to maintain morale through ceremony, simple acknowledgments, praise for endurance, public recognition of effort. These gestures mattered. Stories of past sieges were retold, emphasizing eventual survival. These narratives offered hope without promising relief. Attackers sometimes rotated troops to reduce fatigue. This required coordination and supply depth. Campaigns became national efforts rather than isolated actions. Defenders lacked this luxury. They endured continuously. This imbalance shaped psychology deeply. Some cities attempted deception, fake abundance displayed on walls, empty sacks filled with straw. Thin soup made to look thick. These tricks bought time occasionally. Attackers learned to see through such measures eventually. Experience sharpened perception. The rhythm of siege life settled into predictability. Morning inspections, midday rationing, evening watch, night vigilance. This routine stabilized minds. Breaking routine intentionally became tactic. Sudden assaults at unexpected hours, disruptive noise. These actions aimed to exhaust defenders further. Defenders responded by spreading vigilance, rotating shifts to avoid collapse. The concept of personal future shrank. People focused on immediate survival. Long term plans dissolved. This mental contraction preserved energy. After months or years, populations inside cities changed composition. The weakest died or escaped early. Those remaining were resilient by necessity. When final collapse occurred, whether through breach or surrender, it often felt anticlimactic. Emotion drained away beforehand. Cities that fell were stripped methodically, valuables seized systematically rather than chaotically. This reflected evolved discipline. Survivors adapted rapidly. They accepted new authority quietly, focusing on rebuilding life. Walls were repaired not because of loyalty but habit. Defense was universal interest. In regions with frequent sieges, architecture evolved regionally. Round towers replaced square ones. Angled walls redirected force. These changes spread slowly. Knowledge crossed borders through captured engineers and copied texts. Warfare fostered exchange even among enemies. Over time, the line between civilian and military blurred. Every citizen understood defense. Basic training became common. Siege preparation became seasonal activity. Stores replenished annually regardless of threat. Readiness became permanent state. The psychological weight of constant readiness shaped culture. Caution dominated optimism. People valued stability over change. Trade adapted accordingly. Long term contracts included clauses accounting for interruption. Merchants diversified routes. Sieges thus influenced the economy indirectly by encouraging redundancy. Rulers measured legitimacy by ability to protect cities. Failure undermined authority permanently. Success elevated status. Some leaders invested excessively in defense, neglecting welfare. This imbalance led to internal collapse even without attack. Others balanced carefully, sustaining population morale while maintaining readiness. These cities endured longest. The landscape itself became defensive. Terraces carved to control approach, waterways redirected, subtle changes accumulated. Future generations inherited these ordered environments without understanding origins. They accepted them as natural. Thus, the ancient world continued forward steadily, shaped relentlessly by the expectation and memory of siege, by walls that taught patience and waiting, by societies molded around endurance rather than triumph, carrying each lesson onward without repetition or return, always advancing through time under the quiet pressure of stone, earth, and human persistence. As the long tradition deepened, siege warfare stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a condition of existence. Cities lived under its shadow even in peace. Every quiet year was understood as borrowed time, a pause granted by circumstance rather than permanence. This awareness shaped how people thought about safety, loyalty, and endurance. Generations grew up without ever seeing a siege, yet prepared for one instinctively. They learned where supplies were stored. They knew which streets led to inner defenses. They understood signals without explanation. This knowledge was absorbed casually, like language. Walls were inspected not ceremonially, but habitually. Small repairs were made constantly rather than waiting for visible decay. This quiet maintenance prevented catastrophe more effectively than dramatic rebuilding ever could. Attackers refined their understanding of human behavior. They learned that pressure worked best when steady, not overwhelming. Too much force provoked resistance. Measured threat encouraged fatigue and doubt. Sieges became exercises in psychological erosion. Defenders responded by cultivating resilience. Public displays of calm mattered. Gossip was controlled as much as possible. Leaders addressed crowds regularly, not to promise victory but to normalize endurance. Food preparation adapted further. Cooking methods aimed to extract maximum nourishment from minimal ingredients. Broths replaced solid meals. Slow cooking conserved fuel and softened tough substitutes. These adjustments extended survival incrementally. Fuel itself became precious. Wood was rationed. Charcoal guarded carefully. Fireplaces went cold except during essential moments. Cold became another adversary endured quietly. Clothing layered creatively. Old garments repurposed. Fabrics patched endlessly. Warmth mattered more than appearance. Austerity became fashion by necessity. Sanitation deteriorated inevitably. Waste management struggled under crowding. This increased disease risk. Defenders developed crude systems to cope, prioritizing containment over cleanliness. Burials became communal and discreet. Grief rituals shortened. Space was limited. Emotion was restrained publicly. Private sorrow accumulated silently. Attacking camps faced similar sanitation challenges. Disease outbreaks occasionally forced temporary withdrawal or acceleration of assault decisions. These moments shifted balance unexpectedly. Commanders learned to read illness patterns as signals. They adjusted tactics accordingly. Disease became a strategic factor rather than random misfortune. Sieges altered diplomacy. Alliances formed or dissolved based on perceived endurance. Support promised early often faded as time dragged on. This taught cities to rely primarily on themselves. Messengers arriving with bad news were treated carefully. Morale was fragile. Information release was managed deliberately. Truth was weighed against impact. Defenders sometimes staged controlled optimism. Small successes emphasized, failures minimized. Language mattered immensely. Attackers did the same. They exaggerated damage. They spread rumors of betrayal inside walls. These psychological tactics cost little and yielded much. The sound of bells or horns evolved into complex codes, short signals for fire, long ones for breach, muted sounds for underground danger. Citizens learned to interpret instantly. Children grew accustomed to these signals. They stopped startling at alarms. This normalization worried elders but proved useful. Training drills occurred quietly. Militia practiced movements without spectacle. Efficiency mattered more than morale displays. As time passed, defenders lost track of external politics. Their world shrank to walls and routines. Events beyond felt abstract. Attackers similarly detached. They focused on logistics and progress rather than broader campaigns. Sieges became self contained realities. When relief armies approached, anticipation spiked briefly, but disappointment followed often. Relief was delayed, diverted, or defeated elsewhere. Hope learned caution. Some cities attempted daring escapes. Small groups slipped out to seek aid. These missions were dangerous and rarely decisive, but symbolized defiance. Returnees were celebrated quietly. Their stories reinforced shared identity regardless of outcome. When supplies dwindled dangerously, leaders faced impossible choices. Who ate first? The sick, the guards, the children. Decisions weighed heavily. These choices shaped post siege memory more than enemy actions. Survivors remembered who was fed and who was not. Attacking forces sometimes exploited internal divisions. They offered selective mercy or incentives. This strategy occasionally fractured unity. Cities that maintained cohesion longest survived longest. Unity proved as critical as stone. Architecture inside walls adapted over time. Multi-use spaces, storage, combined with living quarters, rooms designed to convert quickly during crisis. Flexibility mattered. Art became minimalistic, functional, symbolic carvings emphasized protection rather than beauty. Motifs reflected endurance. Language evolved metaphors around siege. Waiting became virtue. Endurance equaled honor. Quick action seemed reckless. Legal systems reflected this value shift. Contracts emphasized obligation during crisis. Failure to contribute defense became serious offense. Markets regulated strictly. Price controls enforced. Hoarding punished. These measures maintained stability imperfectly but effectively. Outside, attackers dealt with boredom through ritual, games, competitions, simple crafts. These activities preserved morale. Commanders allowed limited recreation, understanding its necessity. A demoralized camp failed as surely as a breached wall. Over extended periods, attackers sometimes negotiated rotations with allies, sharing burden of waiting. This required coordination and trust. Defenders lacked such relief. Their endurance was continuous. This asymmetry defined siege psychology. Weather extremes intensified suffering, heat sapped strength, cold stiffened joints, rain rotted materials. Every season introduced new challenges. Defenders tracked weather patterns anxiously. They prepared for storms that might aid or hinder attackers. Fire risk fluctuated. Fire remained greatest fear inside walls. Accidental blazes threatened total collapse. Strict rules governed flame use. Despite precautions, fires occurred. They caused panic beyond proportional damage. Memory of worst case scenarios magnified fear. Attackers attempted to exploit fire risk deliberately. Incendiaries targeted vulnerable sections. Defenders countered with rapid response teams. When successful, fire forced defenders to divert resources, weakening other areas. This tactic was used sparingly to avoid backlash. Sieges also influenced language of time. People spoke of days, not by dates but by events. The day the tower cracked, the night of the fire. Calendars lost relevance. History became experiential rather than numerical. After sieges ended, these time markers persisted in memory, shaping local narratives. Some cities commemorated endurance with understated markers, small inscriptions, simple carvings. These honored survival rather than victory. Children born during sieges were named accordingly. Names reflected hope, resilience, or circumstance. These individuals carried legacy unknowingly. As regions stabilized temporarily, siege knowledge was codified into manuals. Instructions preserved methods systematically. This formalization improved consistency. Training academies emerged quietly. Engineers studied previous failures and successes. This professionalism elevated siegecraft. Defenders studied these texts too. They learned to anticipate attacker logic. Knowledge flowed both ways. This mutual understanding increased complexity. Sieges became slower but more deliberate. Quick collapses grew rarer. Patience became defining virtue on both sides. Commanders known for endurance gained reputations surpassing battlefield heroes. Political legitimacy intertwined with siege success. Rulers who lost cities lost credibility permanently. Some rulers avoided open war entirely, preferring intimidation and blockade to direct assault. This approach reduced risk. Blockades blurred into sieges without walls being breached. starvation achieved goals quietly. Defenders adapted with hidden trade routes, secret stockpiles. These measures extended survival marginally. Eventually, nearly every city experienced siege in some form. The expectation was universal. This universality shaped worldview. Life was seen as preparation interspersed with testing. Survival trumped ambition. Philosophers wrote of endurance as highest good. They framed waiting as moral strength. These ideas influenced education. Stories told to children emphasized clever survival rather than heroic attack. Values shifted accordingly. When cities finally fell or survived, emotional release was muted. Relief replaced joy. Grief replaced anger. Reconstruction followed familiar patterns: repair walls, restock stores, resume routines. People moved forward because stopping was impossible. Sieges left invisible marks on culture. Long after walls were repaired, habits persisted: stockpiling, caution, distrust of abundance. Even generations later, people spoke of danger instinctively. They understood that safety was conditional. Thus, the ancient world continued its steady progression, shaped at every level by the logic of siege, by patience learned through repetition, by societies molded around endurance rather than excitement, always moving forward through time, carrying the quiet weight of walls, waiting, and human persistence without ever circling back or breaking the flow of history. As the rhythm of endurance stretched onward, the world shaped itself around the certainty that pressure would return. Cities no longer treated peace as a separate state. It was simply a quieter phase of preparation. This mindset filtered into every aspect of life, quietly but completely. Marriage alliances were planned with walls in mind. Families preferred unions that strengthened supply networks or secured nearby strongholds. Dowries included grain rights and storage access as often as land or coin. These choices were practical rather than romantic. Birth rates subtly reflected siege expectation. Families balanced hope with realism. Children were valued, but mouths to feed were counted carefully. Survival encouraged moderation even in joy. Medical knowledge advanced slowly under siege conditions. Healers learned to treat malnutrition, infection, and exhaustion more effectively. They improvised remedies using limited resources. This practical medicine spread beyond walls afterward. Defensive drills became seasonal rituals. Every year, citizens rehearsed roles without urgency. These practices embedded responses deeply, reducing panic when danger arrived. Attackers refined long term planning. They calculated not just force but morale decay. They learned when to pause assaults deliberately to deepen defender anxiety. Waiting became weaponized. Defenders countered by celebrating small milestones. Days survived, months endured. These acknowledgments maintained cohesion subtly. Language evolved further. Words for patience and endurance gained nuance. Insults focused on impatience rather than cowardice. Values shifted linguistically. Architecture within cities grew denser. Multi-story dwellings increased. Internal courtyards shrank. Space efficiency mattered. This density increased vulnerability but was accepted trade-off. Fire prevention systems improved. Water access points multiplied. Stone replaced wood where possible. These adaptations reduced catastrophic risk incrementally. Attackers responded by targeting water infrastructure. Understanding its centrality, they focused effort there. Defenders guarded these points obsessively. Siege law developed informally. Rules about conduct towards surrendered cities varied, but patterns emerged. Cities that resisted fiercely expected harsher terms. This understanding influenced decisions. Some cities chose early surrender strategically. Preservation outweighed pride. This pragmatism spread slowly. Others held out to maintain reputation. Deterrence mattered. Long resistance discouraged future attacks, even if costly. These reputations circulated widely. Commanders shared stories. Certain cities inspired dread, others contempt. Perception shaped strategy. Siege engineers recorded failures meticulously: cracked foundations, collapsed towers, engine malfunctions. These lessons prevented repetition. Defenders recorded weaknesses too. Secret archives documented vulnerabilities to address later. This honesty improved resilience. The emotional landscape remained subdued. People learned to suppress extremes. Joy was quiet, grief private, balance preserved energy. Music adapted accordingly. Instruments softened, rhythms slowed, songs stretched long, calming nerves, soundscapes reflected endurance. Children absorbed this atmosphere. They matured with patience embedded. They rarely knew urgency without preparation. Attackers sometimes recruited locals familiar with terrain. This insider knowledge proved valuable but risky. Trust was fragile. Defenders tightened security further. Suspicion became default. This strained social bonds but reduced vulnerability. Markets outside cities adapted to siege cycles. Traders anticipated demand spikes and shortages. They profited cautiously. Economic patterns stabilized around conflict expectation. Investments favored durability over innovation. Stability trumped growth. As walls grew thicker, cities expanded outward cautiously. Suburbs were limited or fortified separately. This constrained growth deliberately. Those living outside walls accepted vulnerability. They evacuated early during threats. This migration strained inner resources. Sieges thus affected demographic patterns. Populations surged inward, then dispersed afterward. These movements shaped culture. Leadership training emphasized crisis management. Future rulers were educated through historical examples focusing on sieges. Success and failure analyzed closely. Moral philosophy reflected endurance. Justice prioritized collective survival over individual rights. These ideas were debated quietly but widely accepted during crisis. When attackers finally withdrew without success, defenders felt mixed relief and emptiness. The threat gone left, psychological vacuum, adjustment took time. Celebrations were restrained, people conserved emotion after prolonged stress, gratitude replaced triumph. Walls were inspected immediately even after victory. Weakness revealed under pressure demanded correction. This urgency persisted. Attackers retreated methodically. They dismantled camps, salvaging materials. They learned from failure as carefully as defenders learned from survival. Knowledge exchange continued indirectly. Captured tools copied, tactics observed. This silent learning improved future campaigns. The land slowly recovered, fields replanted, soils rested, but scars remained in subtle elevation changes and debris layers. Travelers passed through former siege zones unaware of full history. Stones looked ordinary, time smoothed memory. Yet habits persisted. Stockpiles remained larger than needed. Walls stayed guarded even in peace. These behaviors defined normalcy. In regions plagued by frequent sieges, art and literature focused inward. Exploration themes faded. Introspection dominated. This inward focus shaped identity. People valued home and continuity over expansion. These cultures endured but changed slowly. Elsewhere, regions with fewer sieges developed differently, more open, more fluid. But even they eventually adopted defensive thinking as threats spread. Sieges influenced law enforcement, city guards doubled as militia. These blurred roles reduced response time. Training emphasized coordination rather than individual skill. Group survival mattered more than heroics. Punishments for negligence increased. A guard asleep at post faced severe consequences. These examples reinforced vigilance. Trust networks formalized. Neighborhoods organized mutual watch systems. Communal responsibility deepened. Religion incorporated siege metaphors. Divine protection framed as walls, faith as foundation. These ideas comforted believers. Dissent existed quietly. Some questioned endless preparation. They argued for openness. These voices were rarely influential. Experience reinforced caution again and again. Sieges punished optimism harshly. When new fortification techniques appeared, adoption was cautious. Cities tested incrementally rather than overhaul proven systems. Risk aversion guided change. Attackers adapted slowly as well. They balanced innovation with reliability. Unproven methods risked wasting years. This mutual conservatism slowed technological leaps but increased stability. Sieges thus acted as brakes on rapid change. They favored gradual improvement over sudden transformation. Political borders solidified around fortified centers. States defined themselves by what they could hold rather than what they could conquer. This mindset reduced large scale battles but increased prolonged pressure points. War became quieter but longer. Generations lived entire lives between sieges, preparing and recovering without experiencing one directly. The expectations still shaped them. Those who did experience sieges carried authority afterward. Their opinions mattered, their caution guided decisions. Elders recounted waiting rather than fighting. These stories shaped youth perception of war as endurance rather than glory. When cities finally fell after long resistance, memory honored endurance even in defeat. This reframed loss as dignity. Monuments reflected this humility. Simple markers replaced grand triumphal structures. These choices reinforced values. Time continued forward relentlessly. New cities rose, inheriting old habits. The cycle persisted without repetition. Each siege differed in detail but followed familiar rhythm: preparation, pressure, endurance, resolution. This rhythm defined the ancient world quietly. It shaped architecture, society, psychology, and politics without spectacle. No moment reset history. Every event added weight forward. This accumulation defined progress. Thus, life continued steadily through walls and waiting, through human persistence tested again and again, always advancing through time, carrying lessons learned under pressure, never circling back, never breaking the flow, moving onward exactly as the ancient world always did. As years folded into decades, the presence of wars stopped feeling like a response to danger and instead became the shape of daily existence itself. People oriented their lives around fixed stone horizons. They measured distance not by miles, but by how far one could travel before reaching another set of gates. Roads between cities developed predictable rhythms. Caravans timed departures based on rumor tensions. Seasons of safety shortened subtly as political climates hardened. This knowledge passed quietly among traders. Writing from this period shows obsession with logistics. Ledgers mattered more than poetry. Inventories replaced epics because survival demanded accounting rather than inspiration. Education followed suit. Children of elites learned arithmetic before rhetoric. They were taught to calculate grain yields and storage lifespans early. This practicality defined leadership training. Craft specialization deepened further. Some families devoted generations solely to wall maintenance. They understood stone behavior intimately. They listened to walls as others listened to weather. These specialists gained respect not through titles but necessity. When they spoke, rulers listened. Their advice often prevented catastrophe. Attackers refined patience into doctrine. They planned campaigns spanning multiple harvest cycles. They accepted that success might come slowly or not at all. This restraint defined experienced commanders. Young commanders struggled with this. They wanted action. They learned restraint only through failure or counsel. Defenders learned to read attacker behavior. Subtle changes in camp routines signaled intent. These observations guided countermeasures quietly. Communication within cities improved. Signal systems evolved. Flags, drums, fires. These methods conveyed information efficiently without panic. Night watch routines grew more disciplined. Guards rotated frequently to prevent fatigue. Patterns minimized vulnerability. Inside homes, routines adapted. Families planned meals days ahead. Children learned not to waste instinctively. These habits persisted even in peace. Social hierarchies softened slightly during prolonged sieges. Necessity blurred class lines. Shared suffering created temporary equality. After sieges ended, these lines hardened again but never entirely returned to former rigidity. Memory lingered. Economic recovery favored those adaptable. Merchants who shifted goods survived better than those rigidly attached to tradition. Flexibility emerged as quiet virtue. Some cities codified siege protocols formally. Law specified rationing enforcement and labor obligations. This reduced conflict during crises. Others relied on tradition alone. These cities depended heavily on leadership quality. Leadership failures during sieges echoed for generations. Names became cautionary references rather than honors. Songs preserved these memories subtly, not heroic ballads, but slow laments describing waiting. These songs traveled far. Architectural scars remained visible, mismatched stone repairs, uneven towers. These imperfections became historical records readable by trained eyes. Attackers noted these signs too. They studied past repairs to predict weaknesses. History informed strategy directly. As fortifications grew, complex attackers invested in intelligence. Networks of informants emerged. Information became currency. Defenders countered with misinformation. False weakness staged deliberately. These psychological games added new layer to warfare. Siege warfare thus extended beyond physical confrontation into minds. This subtlety suited endurance cultures. Religion continued adapting. Interpretations emphasized patience, humility, acceptance. These messages soothed prolonged anxiety. Dissenting beliefs existed quietly. Some interpreted sieges as tests, others as punishment. These views coexisted uneasily. Medical practitioners documented siege illnesses meticulously. Scientific observation advanced incrementally. These notes influenced future care. Birth during sieges carried symbolic weight. Children born under pressure were seen as resilient or burdened depending on outcome. Naming practices reflected this. Some names invoked endurance, protection, or survival. These names persisted in families. Attackers experienced similar cultural shifts. They too developed rituals and norms around waiting. Camp life formed its own society. Discipline determined success. Desertion punished harshly. Commanders balanced fear with morale carefully. Food distribution in camps mirrored city practices. Fairness prevented unrest among troops. Mutual observation created strange familiarity. Defenders recognized attackers by habit. Attackers recognized defenders by routine. This familiarity humanized enemies slightly. Negotiations occurred intermittently, truces for repairs or burials. These moments paused hostility briefly before pressure resumed. Language during negotiations was formal, restrained. Every word weighed carefully. Trust remained minimal. When peace treaties followed sieges, they often reflected exhaustion rather than victory. Concessions balanced survival. Borders adjusted minimally. Most change occurred psychologically rather than geographically. Memory of siege shaped future diplomacy. Cities avoided provoking those who had tested them severely. Thus, political relationships stabilized around demonstrated endurance rather than ambition. Generational narratives emphasized caution. Children heard stories framed as lessons, not adventures. Travelers carried these stories regionally. This spread defensive mentality widely. As populations grew, fortifications expanded outward slowly. Layer upon layer reflected accumulated fear. Some cities eventually relocated, entirely abandoning old walls. New sites chosen strategically. These decisions were monumental. Abandoned walls decayed quietly, becoming quarries or shelters. They remained reminders of former endurance. Environmental adaptation continued. Deforestation near cities created clear zones. Fields repositioned to reduce vulnerability. This reshaping of landscape affected climate locally. Subtle changes influenced agriculture further. Siege warfare thus altered ecology indirectly. Human conflict reshaped nature gradually. Artisan products reflected sturdiness. Thick pottery, simple tools, ornamentation minimal. Function defined aesthetics. Luxury existed but understated. Even elites avoided excess display during unstable periods. Markets sold preserved foods more prominently. These tastes influenced cuisine long term. Culinary traditions emerged from necessity. Simple, hearty meals suited scarcity. These became cultural staples. Attackers too adopted preserved diets. The monotony of food contributed to psychological strain. Music rhythms slowed, reflecting daily pacing. These rhythms influenced broader culture. Timekeeping methods emphasized days and weeks rather than moments. Long durations mattered. Calendars marked significant sieges alongside religious events. These markers oriented collective memory. As centuries progressed, knowledge accumulated systematically. Manuals compiled best practices. These texts circulated cautiously. Innovation occurred but slowly. Acceptance required proof through survival rather than theory. When rare decisive victories occurred, they reinforced caution rather than boldness. People learned even success carried cost. Thus, the ancient world moved steadily, shaped by prolonged pressure rather than dramatic change. Each generation inherited walls, habits, and expectations. They modified them slightly, but never discarded them. This continuity defined civilization itself: persistence over brilliance, endurance over speed. The rhythm of waiting became background existence, shaping thought, behavior, and structure. No single siege defined history. Altogether, they formed slow shaping force. Time advanced without looping, each experience layered upon previous ones, creating depth. Cities aged, people aged, walls aged together. Through this steady accumulation, the ancient world carried itself forward quietly, enduring stone by stone, season by season, without repetition, without return, always moving ahead, burdened and strengthened by everything it had already survived. As accumulated experience deepened, societies grew quieter rather than wiser. The lessons of endurance did not inspire confidence. They produced caution, layered upon caution, until decision itself felt heavy. Rulers hesitated longer. Councils debated endlessly, not because they lacked courage, but because memory warned them of cost. Succession planning absorbed this anxiety. Heirs were trained slowly. Exposure to pressure came gradually. Youth was protected from crisis until maturity seemed certain. This delayed leadership but reduced rashness. When succession failed or arrived, suddenly instability worsened. Cities without prepared leaders fractured internally long before walls were tested. Internal collapse proved more dangerous than external force. Thus, administrative continuity became as vital as fortification. Archives were guarded carefully, records duplicated. These measures preserved institutional memory. Clerks gained quiet power. They understood systems that rulers relied upon. Their continuity bridged generations. Legal systems reflected siege thinking. Punishments prioritized deterrence. Swift justice prevented unrest. Harshness was justified as necessity. Mercy existed but selectively. Timing mattered. Forgiveness too early invited weakness, too late invited rebellion. This balance required judgment refined through experience. Not all leaders possessed it. Social trust narrowed. Citizens trusted neighbors more than strangers. Guild membership defined identity. Community boundaries hardened. These divisions reduced vulnerability but limited openness. Migration slowed. Cultural exchange narrowed. Yet ideas still traveled. They moved slowly, quietly, embedded in travelers' stories rather than proclamations. Technological diffusion followed similar patterns. Tools spread cautiously. Proven reliability outweighed novelty. Thus, advancement crept rather than surged. This pace suited endurance societies. Warfare outside sieges changed accordingly. Field battles became avoidance exercises. Commanders preferred pressure over risk. The open battlefield felt chaotic, unpredictable compared to controlled waiting. When battles occurred, they were decisive but rare. They punctuated long periods of tension rather than defining them. Survivors remembered battles vividly but spoke more often of waiting afterward. The silence left deeper impression. Cities invested in diplomacy as extension of defense. Alliances reduced siege likelihood. This networked caution stabilized regions. Marriage diplomacy continued reinforcing these ties. Personal unions carried strategic weight. These relationships were transactional, affection secondary. Loneliness among elites increased quietly. Personal letters revealed this isolation. Rulers wrote of weariness rather than ambition. Health suffered. Stress manifested physically. Chronic ailments became common. Healers recognized connection but lacked remedies. Mental resilience became prized trait. More than strength or intellect, endurance defined worth. Children displaying patience earned praise. Impatience corrected firmly. Education reinforced this. Values taught implicitly through repetition rather than instruction. Festivals adapted accordingly. Celebrations shorter, quieter, more symbolic than exuberant. Public rituals emphasized continuity rather than triumph. These rituals grounded communities. Architecture of civic spaces mirrored this. Solid, restrained designs, minimal decoration, stability communicated through form. Monuments commemorated survival rather than conquest. Inscriptions modest, factual. Attackers observing such cities understood resistance would be prolonged. This deterred opportunistic campaigns. Thus, reputation functioned as invisible wall, stronger sometimes than stone. Regions lacking this reputation suffered repeated pressure. They learned slowly through loss. Memory once gained rarely faded completely. It reshaped identity. Geographic features influenced siege frequency. Cities near trade routes endured more pressure. They adapted faster. Remote settlements faced fewer sieges but learned less. When attacked, they struggled. This uneven experience created hierarchy of resilience. Certain cities became anchors of stability. Others depended on them for refuge. This network influenced migration patterns. Refugee influx during sieges strained resources. Receiving cities prepared contingencies for this. These movements spread cultural habits further. Standardized practices emerged regionally. Food preservation techniques spread widely. Smoking, drying, salting, these methods defined cuisine. Taste preferences adjusted, scarcity foods became comfort foods, this emotional association persisted. Art reflected this muted resilience. Images favored stillness, solidity, calm scenes, motion minimized. Storytelling shifted too. Narratives focused on perseverance, not adventure. Heroes endured rather than conquered. This redefined valor. Attackers absorbed similar values over time. They too respected endurance, success measured by persistence. This mutual respect softened extremes of brutality subtly. Negotiated outcomes increased over annihilation. These arrangements preserved resources. Yet cruelty never vanished. Fear remained powerful motivator, but it was calculated rather than impulsive. As centuries layered further, fortifications evolved organically. New walls wrapped old ones, creating shells. Urban planning became complex labyrinthine. These layouts confused attackers but challenged residents too. Knowledge of city became specialized. Residents navigated instinctively, outsiders struggled. This familiarity reinforced belonging, identity tied to place deeply. Exile thus became severe punishment. Removal from known space felt destabilizing. Law used exile strategically to remove dissent without internal violence. Exiles carried siege mentality elsewhere, spreading it unintentionally. Thus, defensive culture propagated beyond original contexts. Language incorporated spatial metaphors extensively, inside, outside, holding pressure. These phrases dominated speech. Thinking itself structured by containment concepts. Time perception slowed. Future planning extended decades ahead. Short term thinking discouraged. This long view stabilized societies but reduced innovation appetite. Risk tolerance decreased steadily. Preservation trumped ambition. This conservatism ensured survival but limited expansion. Empires formed cautiously. They consolidated rather than spread rapidly. Border regions fortified heavily, becoming buffers of endurance. Life in these regions was hardest. Constant preparation defined existence. Yet pride emerged from this hardship. Border communities saw themselves as guardians. This identity strengthened cohesion. When borders shifted, guardianship roles moved. Populations adapted reluctantly. Old fortifications repurposed, new ones constructed. This cycle continued. Environmental consequences accumulated. Forests cleared, stone quarried, landscape bore human imprint. Nature adapted slowly. Wildlife patterns shifted around fortifications. People observed these changes but accepted them as necessary. Philosophy reflected resignation. Humans seen as shaping force entwined with land. Moral discussion centered on duty rather than desire. Personal fulfillment secondary to communal survival. This ethic permeated all classes. Even elites lived constrained lives. Luxury existed but bounded by caution. Displays of excess risked resentment during hardship. Thus, humility became strategic virtue. As time advanced further, the accumulation of structures and habits created dense historical layering. Every action referenced precedent. Innovation required justification through tradition. This slowed change but increased coherence. Communities moved together rather than fracturing. The ancient world thus stabilized into pattern of endurance, not stagnation but measured progression. Each generation adjusted slightly, building upon inherited frameworks. No moment reset the pattern, no loop returned events backward. Pressure eased and returned in different forms, but always forward. Through this slow march, societies refined the art of waiting, until it became second nature. Walls stood, but the true fortification lay in collective patience shaped over centuries. This patience carried civilizations onward quietly through time, adding layer upon layer of experience, never repeating exactly yet, always informed by what came before, moving steadily forward as history continued its long, unbroken path. Over time, the patience cultivated by siege living reshaped not only politics but daily rhythm. Mornings began early, not from urgency but habit. People rose with light because light was resource. Work done early conserved fuel and energy for later hours. This efficiency was survival logic. Markets opened calmly, no shouting frenzy. Buyers inspected goods carefully. Vendors expected scrutiny. Trust built slowly through repeated interaction. Currency circulation slowed. Barriered cities valued stability over volume. Coin hoarding common. Ledgers thickened. Debt existed but cautiously extended. Default risk high during prolonged sieges. So lenders favored kin and guild members. This tightened social webs. Favor exchanges replaced monetary ones. Owed labor counted as currency. Marriage choices reflected this economy. Unions solidified networks, not romance. Love followed practicality when possible. Dowries prioritized movable wealth, silver tools, livestock grain. These survived relocation if walls fell. Inheritance laws evolved accordingly. Division aimed to preserve operational units. Farms, workshops passed intact, fragmentation weakened, resilience so avoided. Religious observance adapted to siege tempo. Prayers emphasized endurance, patience, forgiveness. Quick miracles less expected. Saints associated with protection gained prominence. Walls, chapels dedicated accordingly. Processions traced fortification lines, reinforcing symbolic defense. Music during worship slowed. Chants elongated to fill stone spaces. Sound itself fortified morale. Silence respected equally. Moments of quiet considered disciplined practice. Children learned early to listen, stillness signaled danger or safety. Games mirrored warfare patterns, strategy, patience, territory control, no reckless play. Stories told at night reinforced these values. Legends emphasized clever delays, not sudden heroics. Villains rushed foolishly. Heroes waited, watched, endured. Food culture centered on preservation recipes. Shared meals ritualized scarcity acceptance. Feasts occurred rarely deliberately after crises to mark survival. Clothing favored durability, layered garments, neutral tones, repair valued over novelty, tailors skilled in reinforcement patches, symbolic of resilience. Architecture inside walls adapted for density. Multi-use spaces common, room served storage shelter work, privacy reduced, communal awareness increased, secrets harder to keep. This transparency reduced conspiracy, but increased tension. Conflict resolution prioritized mediation, civil strife weakened defense, councils arbitrated disputes swiftly. Punishments emphasized restitution, not elimination. Even criminals valued for labor. Health practices pragmatic, clean water prioritized, storage systems maintained carefully, waste disposal managed to prevent disease. Medical knowledge focused on wound care, infection control, herbal remedies stockpiled, healers respected but cautious, their roles supportive, not miraculous. Psychological strain acknowledged indirectly, rest periods enforced, celebrations mandated. These maintained morale subtly. Seasonal rhythms still observed but adapted. Harvest festivals quieter, inward focused. Winter particularly tense. Supplies monitored closely. Spring offered relief and vulnerability simultaneously. Strategic campaigns favored warmer months. Weather knowledge crucial. Defenders studied wind patterns for fire defense. Attackers timed operations accordingly. Thus, meteorology became tactical lore. Maps improved gradually, not for exploration but internal navigation. Detailed plans of walls, gates, tunnels, knowledge compartmentalized, security through obscurity. Only select individuals knew full layouts, trust tested constantly. Education systems trained scribes, engineers, quartermasters. These roles essential yet understated. Fame reserved for rulers, but survival owed to planners. This imbalance bred quiet resentment. Occasionally, scribes leveraged knowledge politically. Power thus diffused. Rulers learned to negotiate internally as much as externally. Ceremonies reinforced hierarchy but acknowledged interdependence. Oaths sworn publicly bound leaders to defense responsibilities. Breaking such oaths damaged legitimacy deeply. Propaganda existed but understated. Inscriptions praised vigilance, order, unity. Excessive boasting was avoided as it invited challenge. Foreign visitors were carefully managed. Strength was displayed, not vulnerability. Diplomatic gifts were practical rather than lavish tools, textiles, preserved food. These offerings communicated capability rather than excess. Information moved quietly. Observation mattered. Rumors were tracked, adjusted, counted when needed. Controlling narratives proved as important as controlling walls. Messengers were trained for discretion. Memory was often trusted more than writing, which could be intercepted. Signals enabled communication at distance flags, fires, horns. Codes remained simple and durable. Language adapted to pressure. Shorthand terms emerged to describe stages of containment and readiness. Words became dense with meaning. Poetry reflected this compression. Short verses layered imagery. Long epics became rare, recited slowly over many nights. Oral tradition remained strong, preserving nuance and context. Written records expanded where precision mattered, logistics, inventories, planning, libraries were reinforced, sometimes concealed. The survival of knowledge became a priority. When cities fell, efforts were made to preserve texts through quiet evacuation. These movements reshaped intellectual geography. Sieges indirectly spread learning. Displaced scholars resettled and taught elsewhere. Ideas took root gradually, forming new centers of thought. The process was slow but persistent. Afterward, trade resumed cautiously. Rebuilding followed a familiar order: walls first, then homes. Those who had defended often rebuilt, preserving continuity. Loss lingered quietly. Songs reflected absence without fixation. Communities chose forward motion over dwelling on grief. Memory passed carefully between generations. Elders framed past events as instruction rather than tragedy. This normalized hardship and reinforced resilience. Over time, resilience became identity. Change occurred, but incrementally. New ideas were introduced as extensions of tradition, ensuring acceptance. Thus, siege culture stabilized civilizations. Even during peace, preparedness remained a virtue. Complacency was feared more than distant threats. Philosophers discussed balance, neither panic nor neglect. The ideal leader was steady, patient, attentive. Risk driven charisma was distrusted. Legitimacy became linked to guardianship. Councils favored proven administrators. Succession increasingly emphasized capability alongside birth. Failure was tolerated less. Mechanisms for removal application, deposition developed to prevent disaster. Political evolution and military pressure became inseparable. Over time, fortifications became identity. Cities were recognized by their walls. Travelers described skylines before customs. Poets referenced gates and towers. Memory anchored itself to space. Even language reflected enclosure. Security defined freedom more than openness. Values diverged from nomadic cultures. Though coexistence persisted through trade, border towns acted as mediators, fortified yet hybrid. Their diversity strengthened technique and thought. Siege culture was not uniform. Each region expressed it differently. Yet core principles endured: patience, preparation, community, continuity. History moved forward through accumulation, not repetition. Each crisis informed the next without resetting progress. Memory layered response. Adaptation replaced cycles. As generations continued, vigilance became instinct. Preparation persisted even without immediate threat. Routine replaced fear without erasing readiness. Training began early. Children learned efficiency, quiet movement, signal obedience presented as daily tasks. Endurance mattered more than force. Long effort, controlled breathing, steady labor shaped the body. Mental discipline matched physical conditioning, focus, patience, silence. Education emphasized practical knowledge, arithmetic, geometry, measurement. These supported planning and logistics. Philosophy endured, embedded in ethics rather than debate. Moral instruction favored restraint, foresight, and communal responsibility. Public discourse valued calm consensus. Dissent existed but remained measured. Speech was deliberate. Inflammatory rhetoric discouraged. This control of language reduced panic and stabilized decision making. Councils embodied this approach. Deliberation was slow, methodical, and intentional. Votes often unanimous after long discussion. Public trust depended on visible unity. When disagreement leaked, morale weakened, thus conflict handled privately. Festivals incorporated reminders of defense, marches along walls, symbolic reenactments of past vigilance. These rituals maintained awareness without alarm. Music rhythms echoed marching pace, steady, repetitive, calming. Visual art featured walls, gates, towers integrated into daily scenes, not dramatic. This familiarity reduced intimidation. Foreigners noted calmness behind fortifications. They mistook it for weakness sometimes. Those who tested it learned patience was strength. Economies adapted further. Specialized industries supporting defense thrived. Rope making, metalworking, carpentry, masonry. Skills passed through guilds with strict standards. Quality controlled meticulously. Failure risked catastrophe. Innovation, incremental improvements reinforced reliability. Experimentation limited to controlled contexts. Thus, technology matured slowly but solidly. Logistics, planning, advanced. Storage, rotation, inventory, tracking, surplus distribution protocols established. During peace, reserves maintained deliberately. This discipline prevented decay. Granaries inspected regularly. Officials accountable. Corruption punished severely as betrayal. Public shaming more effective than execution. Social pressure maintained integrity. Religion reinforced this framing. Sins associated with negligence, betrayal. Virtue equated with reliability. Clergy sermons, gentle, repetitive, reinforcing norms. Miracles framed as rewards for patience, not shortcuts. Sacred texts interpreted through endurance lens. Pilgrimages reduced during threats, focusing inward devotion. Sacred spaces fortified, integrated into defenses. Church towers doubled as watchposts. Thus, sacred and martial merged. Family structures adapted, households, multi generational pooling, labor resources, elders respected for memory guidance. Youth deferred decisions longer. Marriage age flexible based on stability. Birth rates moderated intentionally. Resource management influenced family planning. Midwives and elders advised spacing births. This pragmatic approach ensured sustainability. Medical practices incorporated preventative care. Hygiene routines emphasized bathing, regulated water use carefully. Waste systems maintained. Disease feared as internal enemy. Quarantine practices established instinctively. Isolation protocols accepted. Community compliance strong. Artisans developed tools for repair longevity. Objects designed to be fixed, not replaced. This extended resource life symbolically reinforced endurance. Clothing patched proudly visible marks of survival, status indicated by maintenance, not novelty. Rulers adopted similar restraint to model behavior. Extravagance rare, public works prioritized walls, roads, water systems, monuments commemorated collective effort, names of builders inscribed alongside rulers. This recognition fostered loyalty. Historical records detailed procedures, not personalities. Chronicles tracked grain levels, repairs, these mundane entries invaluable. Narratives lacked the drama intentionally. Calm record keeping, stabilized memory, travel within regions regulated, passes issued during threats, movement monitored. This reduced infiltration, trade routes adjusted accordingly, merchants adapted schedules, caravans organized larger, slower groups, safety prioritized, diplomacy maintained through ritual gift exchange, reaffirming peace. These rituals repeated regularly, preventing drift. Border disputes resolved via negotiation, referencing precedent. Law codified extensively. Case law guided decisions. Consistency valued. Judges trained thoroughly. Appeals limited to prevent delays. Justice swift, predictable. This predictability reduced unrest. Military forces maintained readiness without aggression. Drills routine, non provocative. Armor stored accessible. Weapons maintained but concealed. This reduced anxiety. Public spaces designed flexible, convertible to shelters. Markets could transform quickly. Homes built with storage cellars. Urban planning integrated defense invisibly. As years passed, peace extended, but habits persisted. Children grew, never witnessing siege, yet trained regardless. Memory preserved through instruction. This generational transmission prevented forgetting. External powers shifted, rose, fell, but cities anchored by endurance remained stable. They absorbed refugees, assimilated gradually. Integration, slow, deliberate, newcomers taught norms. Resistance met gently, firmly. Cultural continuity maintained. Language evolved, retaining siege metaphors. Proverbs emphasized patience. Songs, lullabies included watchfulness themes. Thus, vigilance soothed rather than alarmed. When occasional conflicts arose, response swift, organized. Preparation prevented panic. These incidents reinforced belief in system. Confidence deepened. Over centuries, this culture shaped identity profoundly. People defined themselves as steadfast. This reputation deterred aggression. Visitors respected order. Even conquerors negotiated. This saved lives. Thus, endurance achieved strategic value. Time passed, marking generations quietly. No dramatic turning point. Incremental refinement continued. Walls thickened here, gates improved there, procedures updated slightly, records annotated. This gradualism ensured adaptation without disruption. Knowledge accumulated. Engineers studied soil, weather patterns. This expertise prevented failures. Failures, when occurred, analyzed meticulously. Blame avoided focus on improvement. This learning culture strengthened systems. Festivals occasionally celebrated anniversaries of survival. These dates marked continuity, not victory. Ceremonies subdued, speeches brief, emphasis on gratitude. As civilizations matured, some walls lost necessity, yet dismantling rare. Structures repurposed, warehouses, dwellings, stones reused, memory preserved physically, landscape layered, paths followed old ramparts, daily life traced history unconsciously. Children played atop walls learning geography. Thus, fortifications integrated into normalcy. This normalization ensured preparedness without fear. As centuries advanced, philosophical reflection deepened. Thinkers wrote of balance between openness and security. Their works circulated slowly. These texts influenced policy gradually. No sudden reforms. Evolution gentle. Thus, ancient world persisted through endurance, not static but resilient, always forward accumulating experience. No loops repeated exactly. Each generation inherited refined habits. History continued its steady progression, shaped by patient hands, steady minds beneath enduring stone, carrying societies onward without pause. As the centuries stretched onward, the inherited calm did not fade, but settled like sediment at the bottom of a river, shaping its flow without being seen. People no longer spoke of fear because fear had been absorbed into structure. It existed quietly inside rules, habits, and expectations, guiding behavior without announcement. Leadership evolved further. Rulers learned that authority rested less on command and more on reliability. A leader who appeared daily, who listened, who remembered names and routines inspired confidence. This steadiness mattered more than charisma. Court life reflected this restraint. Audiences, orderly brief, regular schedules reassured citizens. Visibility mattered more than spectacle. Counselors rotated duties to avoid fatigue. Decisions documented carefully. Mistakes acknowledged, privately corrected publicly. This transparency fostered trust. Military command mirrored civil administration. Clear chains of responsibility defined. Training manuals standardized practices. Veterans mentored recruits, emphasizing patience, awareness. Glory downplayed, survival emphasized. Weapons maintenance treated as ritual. Cleaning, oiling, inspection repeated. This routine soothed nerves. Supply officers held equal status with warriors. This parity recognized logistics as lifeblood. Quartermasters respected. Even language honored this. Blessings invoked fullness of stores and strong hinges. Hinges symbolized readiness often overlooked. Craftsmen specializing in hinges, locks, doors gained prestige. These small components held immense responsibility. Failure there invited disaster. Thus, attention to detail permeated culture. Architecture continued adapting, corners rounded to deflect stress, internal courtyards optimized airflow, light wells conserved fuel, water management advanced channels, filters, clean water preserved health during confinement, public baths regulated schedules to conserve heat, hygiene considered defense, disease outbreaks studied carefully, patterns recorded, quarantine zones designated, compliance high due to shared memory, food distribution systems refined, rations calculated precisely, equity prioritized to prevent unrest, special allowances for children elderly ill. This fairness sustained morale. Markets during threat operated under supervision, price controls enforced, hoarding punished, trust maintained, cultural expression remained subdued yet persistent. Music evolved subtle variations within familiar modes. Listeners found comfort in predictability. Innovation occurred through nuance, not disruption. Storytelling passed lessons indirectly through metaphor. Animals representing patience, endurance, guardianship. Children absorb messages unconsciously. Education integrated physical labor, intellectual study, balance valued. Scholars respected but expected practicality. Abstract speculation tolerated only if grounded. Libraries curated texts relevant to governance, defense ethics. Entertainment favored quiet games, puzzles, strategy. Chance minimized. Gambling frowned upon. Risk aversion institutionalized. Travel narratives, popular reading, descriptions of distant walls, techniques, learning through others' experiences. Pilgrims observed defenses respectfully. Cultural exchange happened through observation, imitation. Artisans returning from travel introduced refinements gradually. Resistance to change softened when framed as improvement. Festivals continued marking seasons and survival, lighting minimal candles symbolic. Feasts simple, nourishing. Speeches thanked workers, builders, watchers. Community recognized. Justice systems further refined restorative practices. Public apologies valued. Reintegration prioritized. Execution rare, used only for betrayal. This restraint reduced internal fear. Population growth stabilized intentionally. Settlement expansion cautious. New districts fortified from inception. Urban sprawl controlled. Rural areas coordinated with city supply lines. Mutual dependence recognized. During peace, military exercises doubled as civic works repairing roads, clearing ditches. This maintained readiness without aggression. Foreign observers noted discipline. They reported calm resilience. Such reputation discouraged attack. Thus, endurance became deterrence. As trade expanded cautiously, wealth increased slowly. Prosperity reinvested in infrastructure, luxury taxed heavily. This prevented disparity. Social cohesion preserved. Philosophical writings matured, exploring ethics of waiting. Authors praised moderation, criticized haste. These texts circulated among elites, shaping policy. Religion adapted, further integrating patience as sacred virtue. Ritual calendars emphasized long cycles. Fast days practiced discipline. Sacred vows tied to guardianship. Pilgrimage routes fortified, providing shelter. Sacred hospitality offered security. Artistic motifs featured cycles, seasons, walls, circular forms symbolizing continuity. Time depicted as flow, not rupture. Memory celebrated. Historical anniversaries commemorated quietly. Names recited. Silence observed. This honored past without reopening wounds. As empires rose, fell cities anchored by endurance persisted. They adapted to new rulers negotiating terms. Autonomy preserved through reliability. Conquerors preferred stable cities. Thus, siege culture conferred bargaining power. Legal charters codified rights, duties. These documents referenced precedents centuries old. Continuity valued. Education for rulers included study of past sieges. Case analysis taught humility. Hubris warned against. This learning prevented rash campaigns. Over time, fortifications became symbols of identity beyond function. People decorated gates with modest carvings. These told stories of builders, not battles. Children learned lineage through stone. Landscape memory deepened. Nature integrated. Vines trained along walls. Gardens atop ramparts. Life softened stone. This integration balanced vigilance with beauty. Psychological health improved. Calm confidence replaced anxiety. When threats emerged, response measured, preparation activated smoothly. No panic. This efficiency deterred escalation. Enemies encountering such resistance reconsidered. Negotiation favored. Thus, peace preserved. As centuries progressed, technology advanced incrementally, tools improved, materials refined. But principle constant, endurance, patience, preparation, societies thrived quietly. No dramatic leaps, just steady progress. Knowledge transmitted, habits reinforced, history moved forward unbroken. Each generation inheriting wisdom without reliving trauma. This continuity shaped civilization deeply. Walls stood as witnesses. People lived within rhythms shaped by them. Time passed, marking endurance. Thus, ancient world carried itself onward, patient, deliberate, resilient, never looping, never forgetting, always advancing quietly beneath the weight of stone and memory. As the long arc finally settled into its later centuries, the habits shaped by walls no longer felt imposed but inherited like language itself. Children learned them without instruction. They walked measured. They listened. They waited. This was not fear, it was familiarity. Cities that endured longest developed an almost quiet confidence. They did not boast, they did not rush. They knew that stone patience and preparation outlasted ambition. Gates opened and closed on schedules unchanged for generations. This predictability reassured everyone inside. Leadership in this age became almost invisible. Rulers functioned more as caretakers than commanders. Their success measured in uneventful years. They presided over calm markets, full granaries, intact walls. This lack of drama was the achievement. Succession passed smoothly more often than not because of luck, but because systems absorbed shock. Heirs trained early in restraint. They learned to preserve, not transform. Architecture reached maturity. Walls optimized, no longer massive but efficient. Gates reinforced subtly. Maintenance replaced expansion. This economy of effort reflected wisdom. Interior spaces softened. Life became more comfortable without abandoning vigilance. Homes, warmer light managed better. Water flowed more reliably. These comforts did not weaken defense, they strengthened morale. Cultural memory preserved through craft. Songs quiet, repetitive. Work, chants steady. Melodies passed down, generations unchanged. These anchored time. Elders spoke less. They had said everything already. Youth listened, absorbed, then continued. Trade networks stabilized. Secure corridors developed. Trust established slowly. These routes sustained prosperity without inviting excess. Art depicted ordinary scenes, people repairing, walking, waiting, children playing atop walls under watchful eyes. This normalization of defense ensured continuity. Religion emphasized stewardship, prayers thanked rather than begged, gratitude replaced desperation. Philosophers wrote of balance achieved, not sought. They warned against forgetting. They praised patience as highest virtue. Legal systems solidified, codes refined little, consistency valued more than reform. This stability minimized unrest. Education focused on competence. Children trained to do things well repeatedly. This mastery ensured reliability. Festivals remained but understated. No grand displays, just acknowledgement of survival. Time itself felt different, unhurried, measured by seasons, repairs, harvests, rather than events. External threats dwindled, not vanished, but response so practiced that crises passed quickly. Walls became landmarks. Children traced fingers along stones counting generations. Some fortifications repurposed, fully turned into dwellings, storage gardens, but their presence remained symbolic. People still spoke of inside and outside safety and exposure. These concepts framed identity. As centuries closed, the siege mentality no longer defined by war but by care. Care for structures, systems, people. This care ensured endurance. History did not end. It continued quietly beyond record. No final siege, no collapse, no dramatic farewell. Just continuation. Communities persisted, shaped by patience, readiness, shared memory. Walls weathered stones, worn smooth by hands. People lived, worked, aged, passed knowledge onward. Thus the ancient world carried forward not in conquest or collapse, but in steady survival. The story moved on without repeating, without looping, always forward, shaped by endurance learned long ago beneath the weight of stone.